It was nearing midnight when I locked up the diner for the night. The rain was relentless, soaking everything under its cold, pounding rhythm. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder, a frail woman drenched with a shawl clinging to her thin frame. I hesitated for a moment but rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded silently, her pale face expressionless. She climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her shawl tightly. "Where to?" I asked, but she only pointed forward. Her silence was unnerving, but I chalked it up to exhaustion or the rain. The car smelled faintly of damp earth, and I couldn't help but glance at her every so often. Her eyes seemed distant, staring ahead as if she wasn't truly there. As we drove, I noticed her lips move slightly as though whispering to herself. The words were too faint to hear, drowned out by the rain hitting the windshield. We stopped at a gas station, and I offered to grab her a coffee. She nodded again, her movements slow and deliberate. When I returned with the coffee, the car was empty. The passenger door was ajar, the seat wet where she had been sitting, but she was nowhere to be found. I stepped out into the rain, calling for her, but the lot was empty. Confused and unnerved, I checked the surrounding area but found no trace of her. Shrugging it off as a bizarre encounter, I drove home, trying to forget the incident. But the image of her vacant stare and the sound of her faint whispers stayed, with me gnawing at my mind. That night, I woke to the sensation of being watched. The air in my apartment felt heavy, the kind of weight that presses on your chest and makes breathing harder. Turning on the bedside lamp, I froze. There she was, standing in the corner of my bedroom, her soaking shawl dripping onto the floor. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes locked onto mine. My scream tore through the silence as I scrambled to turn on every light in the apartment. When I looked back, she was gone, leaving only a faint puddle where she had stood. I called a friend and spent the rest of the night at their place, too shaken to return home. The next day, I packed my things and decided to move out as soon as possible. Even in my new apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The occasional wet footprint appeared on my hardwood floor, and the scent of damp earth sometimes filled the air without explanation. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but the fear never truly left. Whatever she wasn't bound to a place. She was bound to me. I never picked up another hitchhiker again. Some nights, I wonder if I should have asked more questions, tried to understand who or what she was. But deep down, I know the answer wouldn't bring me peace. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some passengers should never be offered a ride. I was 17, stuck at a party I didn't want to attend. My so-called friends had left without me, stranding me in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. It was late, and the streets were dark and deserted. I decided to try hitchhiking, sticking my thumb out nervously as cars whizzed by. After what felt like forever, a beat-up sedan pulled over, its driver leaning across the seat to unlock the door. The man behind the wheel was older, maybe in his 40s, with greasy hair and a thin, unsettling smile. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated but climbed in, desperate to get home. As we drove, he asked oddly specific questions: where I lived, if I lived alone, and if anyone would be waiting for me. My stomach tightened with every word. I tried to keep the conversation light, but his gaze darted toward me far too often, lingering just a little too long. He reached over at one point, brushing my knee as he pretended to adjust the radio. I wanted to jump out right then, but we were speeding down an empty road, and my fear kept me frozen. "You've got nice hands," he said suddenly, his eyes flicking toward me with a smirk. My heart pounded as I mumbled a thanks, trying to focus on the passing streetlights. When he turned onto a quieter street, alarm bells went off in my head. "This isn't the way to my house," I blurted. He grinned, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "Just a shortcut," he said. I reached for my phone, trying to text someone, anyone, for help. But before I could, he snatched it from my hand, tossing it onto the back seat. "No distractions," he muttered. Panic surged through me as I stared out the window, my mind racing for a way out. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, flashing blue and red lights appeared in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing us, its siren piercing the quiet night. "What now?" the man muttered, pulling over reluctantly. As the officer approached, I seized my chance. I opened the door, stumbling out and yelling for help. The officer separated us immediately, his stern voice demanding answers. I explained everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The man's demeanor shifted, his confidence evaporating as the officer questioned him. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, but his nervous tone betrayed him. They found something. In his glove compartment, a knife wrapped in a cloth. I never found out what happened to him after that night, and honestly, I didn't want to know. The officer gave me a ride home, his reassuring presence helping to steady my nerves. I stopped going to parties after that, and I certainly never hitchhiked again. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder how that ride might have ended if the police hadn't shown up. The night was a blur of music, laughter, and far too much alcohol. I'd gone to a college party with friends, but by the end of the night I couldn't remember how I ended up outside. I woke up on the roadside, the cold asphalt pressing against my cheek. My head throbbed, and the taste of stale liquor lingered in my mouth. The road was empty except for the faint glow of headlights approaching in the distance. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to my feet, waving at the oncoming car. It slowed to a stop, the driver rolling down the window. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. He looked harmless enough, middle-aged, balding, with a kind expression. I hesitated but nodded, explaining I needed a ride. Back to campus. He unlocked the door, and I climbed in, grateful for the warmth. As we drove, the man made small talk, asking where I'd been and why I was alone. His tone was friendly, but something about the way he glanced at me felt off. His questions became more probing. "Do you live alone? Is anyone expecting you tonight?" My unease grew with every mile, but I tried to brush it off as paranoia. That's when I noticed the route. We weren't heading toward campus anymore. Instead, we were veering into unfamiliar, wooded territory. "This doesn't look right," I said, my voice trembling. The man's expression darkened, his kind demeanor evaporating. "Relax," he said flatly, his eyes fixed on the road. "Just taking a shortcut." My heart raced as I scanned the car for anything I could use to defend myself. The door handle felt cold under my fingers, and I debated jumping out, but the car was moving too fast. The road grew darker, the trees pressing in like ominous sentinels. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He didn't answer, his grip on the wheel tightening. The car came to an abrupt stop in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the seatbelt. Before I could react, he reached for me, his hand gripping my arm like a vice. I screamed, kicking wildly, and managed to break free, tumbling out of the car and into the darkness. I ran blindly into the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms. His footsteps thundered behind me, his angry shouts echoing through the trees. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but I didn't stop. Finally, I spotted lights in the distance, a cabin or a house, I wasn't sure. Bursting through the underbrush, I reached the door and pounded on it desperately. An older man answered, his confused expression quickly turning to concern. "Help me," I gasped, collapsing on his porch. He called the police, and I sat shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. By the time they arrived, the driver was long gone. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he intended, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he told me to get out of the car. I was backpacking through France in my early 20s, living on a tight budget and relying on the kindness of strangers for rides. Hitchhiking was common back then, and I thought nothing of it when a blue sedan pulled over on a quiet country road. The driver, a man in his 40s, greeted me with a friendly smile. "Heading to Bordeaux?" he asked in heavily accented English. I nodded, grateful for the lift. The first hour of the ride was uneventful. He spoke little, keeping his eyes on the road while I admired the rolling countryside. Something about him felt off, though. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, and he avoided eye contact when I asked questions. Still, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. After all, he was doing me a favor. As we drove further, the landscape grew more isolated. Fields gave way to dense forests, the sun casting long shadows across the narrow road. "Shortcut," he muttered when I asked about the route. My unease deepened, but I tried to remain calm. The smell of stale cigarettes filled the car, mingling with something faintly metallic. That's when I noticed the stains, dark, irregular splotches on the passenger seat and floor mats. My pulse quickened as I realized they looked like dried blood. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. He glanced at me for the first time, his smile returning, but this time it felt predatory. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't it be?" My instinct screamed at me to get out, but we were in the middle of nowhere. Then he started talking, slowly, almost conversationally. "You know, I pick up hitchhikers a lot," he said, his tone unsettlingly casual. "Some of them never make it to their destination." My stomach churned as his words sank in. I tried to play along, laughing nervously. "That's a dark sense of humor you've got," I said, praying he'd drop the act. But he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached over and locked the doors. My heart pounded as I gripped the seat, trying to think of a plan. The road ahead stretched endlessly, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in on us. As he slowed the car to take a turn, I seized my chance. I unlocked the door and threw myself out, rolling onto the gravel shoulder. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline pushed me to my feet. I sprinted into the forest, the sound of his car skidding to a stop behind me. His angry shouts followed me as I weaved through the trees, desperate to stay hidden. Hours later, I stumbled onto a highway and flagged down a truck driver who took me to the nearest police station. I never saw the man again, but years later, I read about a serial killer in France who targeted hitchhikers. His description matched the man I had escaped. To this day, I wonder how close I came to being one of his victims, and I've never set foot in a stranger's car since.